For every cop who swears to protect, there's one who abuses their power. In this video, we reveal corrupt cops who hid behind their uniforms until justice caught up with them. Watch their shocking reactions as they realize they're not above the law.
Dream turned into a nightmare. Mendoza saying in court today that the remorse he feels every day for TJ's death is a life sentence.
On March 1st, 2022, 12-year-old Thomas TJ Siderio was shot 3 times, dying after a third shot to his back in South Philadelphia. The perpetrator? 26-year-old police officer Ed Saul Mendoza. On the unfortunate day of the shooting, Mendoza and 3 other plainclothes officers were investigating a stolen gun that had been posted on Instagram the week before, and the lead they got had led them to Siderio and a 17-year-old. According to the officers, the 17-year-old in question had stolen the gun and was the one who made the post. However, when Mendoza and the remaining officers tried to talk to Siderio and the other boy, Siderio fired a gun at the officers in the car, causing one of the officers to get broken glass in his eyes. The police officers with Mendoza said the shot came through the back of the car the moment the police lights came on, causing them to argue that Siderio intentionally shot at a police car. Siderio and the other teen ran in different directions, and Mendoza started chasing Siderio. The 12-year-old tossed the gun and started running. During the chase, Mendoza shot at Siderio twice. He shot him before he tossed the gun and after he tossed the gun. Siderio was face down when Mendoza fatally shot him in the back. Siderio was unarmed at the time of the shooting and died immediately.
It is certain that Thomas Siderio, at the time he was shot, was essentially face down.
After the shooting was ruled a homicide, Mendoza was fired and arrested for the murder of Thomas Siderio. Mendoza was charged with first-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and possession of an instrument of crime. It was revealed during a lawsuit that Siderio was a foster child and had been moved from his former family 6 months before he was shot. According to prosecutors, Mendoza shot Siderio after it was obvious that he was no longer a threat.
The family of a 12-year-old who was shot and killed by a Philadelphia police officer has filed a lawsuit against the city. Ed Saul Mendoza is charged with murder.
Part of the lawsuit stated that because of Mendoza's misconduct, his family was entitled to compensation from the state. It read, "As a result of the defendant's misconduct, TS's survivors seek compensation for the economic and non-economic losses they have suffered as a result of his death." In April 2024, Mendoza pled guilty to the third-degree murder of Thomas Siderio, and in July 2024, he was sentenced to 8 to 20 years in prison. Before he heard his sentence, Mendoza expressed remorse and said he felt sorrow and regret for murdering Siderio. His attorney spoke for him after the sentencing and said Mendoza claimed he would spend every day he was in prison atoning for his mistakes. Ed Saul Mendoza's tragic decision to shoot and kill based on a perceived threat shocked the public, and the next case bears chilling similarities. In December 2019, 43-year-old Hank Berry was accosted in his home by 4 officers before he was shot in the back. The man who delivered the fatal shot was 35-year-old Alvin Peterson. Peterson and the other officers had responded to Berry's home because of his alleged abuse of the 911 system. According to reports, Berry was concerned about the welfare of his 9-year-old son, who was living with his mother. He found out that his son had gotten a black eye while he was in his mother's custody. However, when the officers pulled up to Berry's house, they had come without a search warrant.
Up the phone from 911.
I do not want to come outside.
Yes, sir.
Okay. They're trying to kill me!
Berry refused to come outside of his home when he realized that the officers didn't have a search warrant. He attempted to close the door, but the officers forced their way in and tried to arrest him. Berry became agitated, and as a result, a struggle ensued. Soon enough, Berry got his hands on a taser, and in response, Pearson shot him in the back. Berry passed away minutes later in the living room. Police body cam footage showed the encounter that led to the murder of Berry. Pearson wasn't charged for the murder of Berry until 2021. He was charged with second-degree murder, firearm and assault, voluntary manslaughter, and a misdemeanor charge of illegal entry. The second-degree murder charge was quickly thrown out as Pearson pleaded not guilty. The case went to trial in September 2021, and during the first court session, Henry Berry Jr., the father of the victim, took the stand and gave his impact statement. He believed that his son's murder was avoidable and that it was an unnecessary crime to commit. He said, "My son was a loving child, a very kind person who dedicated his life to raising his son. It was such an unnecessary crime for a telephone call. My son was trying to protect his son from danger, and he lost his life over it.
It was such an unnecessary for a telephone call.
His father taking the stand Friday, saying through tears, Barry was a kind, loving father.
Pearson's lawyer, Tim Clancy, said that Barry was a troubled soul who was paranoid, irritable, and confused. According to Tim Clancy, Pearson didn't have a choice but to shoot Barry. In December 2022, Pearson was sentenced to 11 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter and a misdemeanor charge of illegal entry. However, the sentence ended up being appealed, and Pearson got 5 years of his sentence suspended because of good behavior. Before Pearson was escorted out of the courtroom, he had a few things to say. He expressed remorse for what he did and told the court that it wasn't intentional. He said, "I spent almost all of my adult life serving the Commonwealth. I only want to help. I want Mr. Barry's family to know that I never wanted Mr. Barry to be hurt. I wish I was a better police officer, and I will live with that for the rest of my life."
He had no ill will to towards Mr. Barry. Certainly had no malice or malicious thoughts towards Mr. Barry.
Pearson's attorney believed that his sentence should be less because he had no ill will or malice against Barry and should not have been charged with voluntary manslaughter. Alban Pearson's deadly decision rooted in perceived danger is unsettling, but the next case involves an officer whose actions raised questions about accountability in law enforcement. In Chicago, Illinois, Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by a police officer on October 20th, 2014. The police officer in question was Jason Van Dyke. A few minutes before 10 p.m. that night, police officers were called in to investigate McDonald because there were reports that he was carrying a knife and breaking into trucks around the area. In response to these reports, Jason Van Dyke and 8 other officers went to the area. When the officers confronted 17-year-old McDonald, he used the 3-inch knife he had been carrying to slash the tire of one of the patrol vehicles. He also broke the windshield and began walking away after he did that. He ignored all verbal instructions from the officers to drop the knife. The officers started requesting taser backup, and as they were doing that, Van Dyke started moving toward McDonald. McDonald was walking away from him when he fired the first shot. The 17-year-old spun and fell to the ground. Despite not showing any signs of threat, Van Dyke went on to shoot him 15 more times in under 15 seconds. He used up all of the bullets in his 9mm semi-automatic firearm. According to reports, Van Dyke was not the first officer to arrive at the scene. He had been on the scene for less than 30 seconds and started shooting less than 6 seconds after he came out of his patrol car. The officer who had responded at first said he didn't see the need to use force, and they weren't expecting what Van Dyke did. McDonald was pronounced dead, and at first the murder was ruled a justifiable homicide and within the boundaries of using force. However, dashcam footage discredited the initial police report that had described McDonald as a worse threat than he was. The report described McDonald as crazed, saying that he had lunged at the officers with his knife and attacked them instead of doing what he was commanded. However, reports showed that the knife that McDonald was holding was closed and posed no harm to Van Dyke. In 2015, the dashcam, which had been withheld from the public, was released. It did not contain audio, and this was against policy. However, it was revealed that Van Dyke's dashcam had been intentionally damaged. Reports showed that the microphones were removed and were found in the glove compartment. The family of McDonald got a $5 million settlement, even though the family did not file a wrongful death suit. As it turned out, part of the settlement deal included the condition that the dashcam footage proving that Van Dyke was guilty would not be called into question no matter what. The city of Chicago rejected 15 requests to release the video until Cook County Judge Franklin Valderrama denied the city's request to not release the video showing the murder of Laquan. On November 24th, the video was released. As a result, Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder, and he immediately turned himself in to authorities. On December 16, 2015, he was indicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder, 16 counts of aggravated battery, and 1 count of official misconduct. This dashcam footage that was released to the public led to protests sparked by the brutal murder of McDonald. They chanted slogans like 16 shots and others to show that Laquan McDonald was another victim of police brutality. The protests went on for months, with many people getting arrested for disrupting public conduct. Eventually, on January 18, 2019, Van Dyke was sentenced to less than 7 years in prison for second-degree murder, instead of what he was actually charged with. What enraged the public even more was that the Illinois Department of Corrections refused to disclose the prison where Van Dyke was incarcerated. As a result, he was moved to the Federal Correctional Institution, where he was soon assaulted by other inmates.
He was released from the downstate Taylorville Correctional Center shortly after the clock struck midnight.
He was moved to another correctional institution, but he was soon released from prison after serving less than 3 years of his sentence. According to reports, he was released on good behavior. On February 3, 2022, Van Dyke was released from prison. Activists were furious to learn that Van Dyke had been released from prison after he got a lesser sentence for brutally murdering McDonald. Many people said that the city didn't care about the rights of black people. After he was released, more protests started, and many court-mandated police reforms were ordered after he was released. If you thought the Jason Van Dyke case was shocking, the story of William Melendez takes it to another level. From excessive force to brutal abuse of power, what happens next will leave you questioning the very people sworn to protect.
That celebrated after the defendant was beaten and cuffed. The video in the car shows the police officer's fist bump as a celebratory act of bravery.
William Melendez, an officer with the Detroit Police Department, was known among his co-workers as RoboCop for his aggressive policing tactics. On January 28, 2015, William faced controversy when he assaulted Floyd Dent, an African-American man, during a traffic stop. The incident began when William forcibly removed Dent from his vehicle, leading to a violent altercation. During the encounter, William choked and punched Dent several times, leaving him bloody and requiring medical attention. The police department initially accused Floyd Dent of illegal drug possession and resisting arrest. But months later, when the dashcam footage of the incident was released, the truth came to light. William's actions were found to be excessive and illegal. The release of the video led to Melendez's suspension and, ultimately, to his firing. All charges against Floyd Dent were dropped, as he insisted that Melendez planted narcotics on him during the traffic stop. Evidence supports his claims, and the police department's initial allegations were disproved. In November 2015, Melendez was convicted of assault charges with intent to cause great bodily harm, but was acquitted of strangulation. This conviction barred him from ever again being a police officer or owning a firearm. William's actions had serious consequences for his personal and professional life.
Assault with intent to do great bodily harm less than murder, complainant Floyd Dent. As to count 3, misconduct in office.
William received a sentence ranging from 13 months to 10 years concerning his assault on Floyd Dent during a traffic stop. In an attempt to mitigate his sentence, William pleaded with the judge, saying he struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a result of his time in the military and years as a police officer in high-crime areas, and claimed he had no idea why he assaulted Floyd. As William spoke in court, he appeared calm and collected. Although the judge acknowledged that William was a decorated officer, she said his actions were horrible.
I am truly sorry that you believe my actions were unjust. Please have faith in your law enforcement officers.
Blaming post-traumatic stress or denying that you knew the reason or you can't figure out the reason why you beat this man, I think it bodes very poorly for him.
In around 2017, William was up for parole. Several supporters of William wrote letters to the parole board advocating for his release. One letter in particular was written by a retired Detroit police commander, highlighting William's accomplishments and the character of his career as a law enforcement officer. The parole board also reviewed dozens of awards that William had received throughout his career. After considering the various factors, the parole board ultimately agreed to release William Melendez on January 24, 2017. After witnessing William Melendez's abuse of power, the next case brings even more chilling revelations.
But behind the happy facade, Drew was a serial womanizer. He repeatedly left one wife for a younger model, a pattern that led him to murder his third wife, Kathleen, and many believe his fourth wife, Stacy.
After Drew Peterson graduated from high school, he decided to enlist in the Army. During this time, he met his first wife, Carol Brown, and they married. Drew's time in the military came to an end, and he decided to join the Bolingbrook, Illinois Police Department. Drew worked as a patrol officer for several years before being promoted to the narcotics unit. In this role, he became an undercover detective, allowing him to investigate criminal drug-related activities. However, while undercover, Drew's actions led to complications in his personal life. Carol, his first wife, filed for divorce when she discovered that Drew was sleeping with other women during his shifts. In 1982, Drew married his second wife, Victoria Connolly. However, Victoria later revealed that her marriage to Drew was characterized by abuse and control. Drew's behavior became erratic, and he exhibited signs of being mentally unstable. Around the same time, Drew found himself under investigation by his superiors at the Bolingbrook Police Department. The accusations against him centered around his failure to report bribes he had received while undercover. This breach of trust eventually resulted in his being fired from his job. However, Drew was not deterred. He applied for reemployment and was ultimately rehired, albeit at a lower rank. The added stress of the ongoing investigation took a toll on his marriage to Victoria. In 1992, Drew divorced his second wife, Victoria. 2 months after their divorce, he married Kathleen Savio. However, this marriage did not last, and Drew and Kathleen separated in 2001. According to Kathleen's loved ones, she experienced a significant transformation throughout her marriage to Drew. They believed that Drew's controlling personality had a stifling effect on her. As time went on, the relationship between Drew and Kathleen deteriorated significantly. In 2002, Kathleen obtained an order of protection against Drew, alleging domestic violence. 1 year later, the couple officially divorced, and at that time, Drew was already pursuing a relationship with his future fourth wife, Stacy. When Drew met Stacy, she was a teenager working a night shift at a hotel. Drew and Kathleen's relationship remained contentious, as they frequently had to exchange custody of their children. Between 2002 and 2004, there were 18 domestic violence reports filed by Kathleen against Drew. The last weekend in February 2024, Drew had custody of his and Kathleen's children. However, when he went to return them that Sunday, no one was there. On Monday, March 1st, Drew asked Kathleen's neighbors to accompany him into her house to check on her, as no one had heard from her for a few days. When they entered, the neighbors and Drew made a horrifying discovery. Kathleen was found in the dry tub, unconscious, and had a large wound on her head. It was evident that she was dead. Following the initial autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the manner of death was accidental. However, those familiar with Kathleen had suspicions about her ex-husband, Drew. According to Stacy, Drew's fourth wife, Drew was with her at the time of the incident. Stacy stated that they had spent the night together, providing Drew with an alibi for the time of Kathleen's death. Over the years, Stacy and Drew had children of their own. However, in October 2007, Stacy failed to show up for a project that her sister had assigned her. This behavior was uncharacteristic of Stacy, as she was a devoted mother and would never leave her children behind. As a result, her sister filed a missing person report with the police on October 29th. When questioned about Stacy's whereabouts, Drew claimed she had left him for another man. This statement did not sit right with those who knew Stacy. As suspicion fell on Drew for Stacy's disappearance, the detectives decided to delve into his past and investigate the death of his third wife, Kathleen Savio. This investigation ultimately led to the exhumation of Kathleen's body and the determination that she died by homicide. In 2009, Drew was arrested and charged with murdering Kathleen, and his trial began in September 2012. He was found guilty of the crime and was sentenced to 38 years in prison. When the judge announced the sentence, Peterson erupted in anger, screaming, "I did not kill Kathleen." Kathleen Savio's sister shouted back at him, "Yes, you did, you liar." The outburst escalated into a heated exchange, and the judge ordered Stacy Peterson to be removed from the courtroom.
Peterson yelled out in court, "I did not kill Kathleen."
Several years later, in 2016, Drew received another 40-year sentence for attempting to arrange a hit on the life of the state attorney who tried his case. To this day, Drew still maintains his innocence from behind bars. Stacy's whereabouts remain unknown, and Drew remains the prime suspect in her disappearance. Drew Peterson's disturbing history of manipulation and violence left a trail of unanswered questions, but the next case takes a darker turn.
This interrogation room interview is dated February 13th, 2023. Searchers found Susanna Morales' remains just days earlier near Highway 316. At one point, investigators tell Bryant they found his gun.
In February of 2023, 23-year-old Doraville police officer Miles Bryant was arrested and charged with multiple offenses in relation to the death of 16-year-old Susanna Morales. Susanna, who had disappeared the previous July, had sent a text message to her mother indicating that she was on her way home. However, she never arrived at her destination, and her remains were later discovered in a wooded area off Georgia Highway 316. Officers conducted a thorough search of the area where Susanna's body was located. During this search, they discovered a loaded Glock pistol. The firearm was registered to Miles Bryant, but he had reported it stolen the day after Susanna disappeared. However, it was later revealed that Miles had asked a detective not to investigate the theft of the firearm. This request raised suspicion among investigators, prompting them to examine the location data from Miles' phone. Analysis of the location data revealed that the phone had been in the wooded area where Susanna's body was located around 1 a.m. the night Susanna went missing. This discovery provided significant evidence linking Miles to Susanna's disappearance and death. The detectives conducted an interview with Miles Bryant, but he claimed he had no idea who Susanna Morales was and had nothing to do with her disappearance. Despite his denials, the evidence suggested otherwise, and Miles was taken into custody. A motion was filed to introduce evidence indicating that Miles Bryant had allegedly kidnapped and killed Susanna Morales to fulfill a sexual urge. The motion also stated that Miles had reportedly used his position as a police officer to go through people's phones he arrested or encountered during his shifts, and then sent that private media, usually sexual photos, to himself. There was also mention of 4 other times when Miles Bryant exhibited deviant behavior. In 2018, a 16-year-old girl named Susanna experienced an unfortunate incident in which her underpants were repeatedly stolen by an individual named Miles Bryant. However, Susanna decided not to file a police report due to the advice of another officer. This officer reassured Susanna that Miles had a promising career in the military, and that involving the police and filing charges could potentially ruin it. Fast forward to 2024, when Miles Bryant found himself on trial for Susanna's murder. The trial resulted in Miles being found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before receiving his sentence, Miles had the opportunity to address the court and express remorse.
I just want to apologize to everybody and to the victim's family.
Miles Bryant's betrayal of trust exposed a horrifying darkness, but the next case centers on another shocking abuse of power.
Tonight, a former Pentagon police officer is facing more than 2 decades behind bars for a deadly double shooting in Montgomery County.
This is David Dixon, a former Pentagon police officer. In April 2021, he shot and killed 2 men in the parking lot of his building. He was in the parking lot of his Maryland apartment complex when he reportedly saw these men breaking into a car. He was off duty when he shot at 3 men who he claimed were trying to steal a car. He shot 32-year-old Dominic Williams and 38-year-old James Lionel Johnson while they were trying to escape with a car they had broken into. A 3rd man named Michael Thomas survived the shooting and became a witness in the case. Dixon claimed that he shot in self-defense because the burglars were driving towards him. However, video evidence showed that Dixon shot them after the car passed him, and there was no threat to his life. The man who survived said that Dixon had shot without any form of justification, especially as he was off duty. He would have gotten off with a lighter sentence if he hadn't shot them as a form of stopping them from stealing the car. His attorney said that he did a heroic act because he stopped the burglars from stealing the car. The only survivor admitted to stealing the car on a 911 call after he drove away from the scene of the shooting. This wasn't Dixon's only example of a trigger-happy mentality. In 2020, he pointed a rifle at a homeless woman who was wearing flip-flops in the lobby of his building. He wasn't charged for this offense. Dixon was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his actions, and before he was let away, he apologized for his actions. He told the court that he instinctively reacted, according to his training, but that he was remorseful for what he did. If what David Dixon did shocks you, wait until you hear about the brutal crimes that Wayne Couzens committed because he had a police belt and badge to aid him.
A wholly blameless victim of grotesquely executed crimes. Sarah Everard's final hours, said the judge, as bleak and agonizing as it's possible to imagine.
In the case of Wayne Couzens, you would not expect what he did under the umbrella of being a cop. It will chill you to your bones. Wayne was a metropolitan officer who was arrested and suspected of kidnapping and murder. In South London, England, 33-year-old Sarah Everard was kidnapped on the 3rd of March, 2021. She had been walking home from a friend's house without knowing she was being followed by a white car. This car had been rented by Couzens from a dealership earlier that morning in Kent. Dashcam footage showed Couzens parking near Sarah and the 2 standing beside the car. As it turns out, Couzens showed Sarah his police warrant card before handcuffing her and pretending to arrest her for breaching COVID-19 guidelines. The next time the car was spotted, it was captured by CCTV around Kent. Later that night, it is believed that Couzens transferred Sarah to a different car in Shepherdswell and her there. After doing this, he strangled her with his police duty belt. The next time he was seen, Couzens had once again switched to his rental car and drove to a gas station where he was seen buying gas, big builder bags, and duct tape. It seemed like he decided to get rid of Sarah. Couzens then burnt Sarah's body in a refrigerator and dumped her remains in a pond near Couzens' part of his family's property in Hodes Wood, Ashford. On the 8th of March, Couzens turned in his handcuffs and police belt after saying he was suffering from stress. He was arrested on the 9th of March because he was the last person who saw Sarah. She had called her boyfriend before Couzens kidnapped and murdered her. Her boyfriend contacted the police and the search identified Couzens as the primary suspect in her murder.
Do you know Sarah? I don't know. Okay.
For a while, Couzens repeatedly denied ever having interactions with Sarah, even though they showed him a picture of the victim. The officers in charge of the investigation were convinced that Wayne was their culprit, so they pressed further. What Couzens said after their persistence would shock you.
I am in financial, and I've been lent on by, I don't know who they are. They're a group, a gang, whatever. And they told me, right, I need to go and pick up girls and give them to them.
Couzens claimed that he had paid for sex in Folkestone, and as payment, a gang of Eastern Europeans had threatened to harm his family unless he gave them another girl because he had underpaid a sex worker a few weeks before kidnapping Sarah. He claimed that this was the reason he had kidnapped Sarah, so he could hand her over to the gang. He didn't give any defined answers to any of the questions he was asked about how the gang contacted him.
They threatened to take my family away from me. So, at that point, I'm doing what I can to protect my family.
Eventually, Couzens confessed to kidnapping and murdering Sarah Everard on June 8, 2021. He was sentenced in September to life in prison with the tariff of a whole life order, meaning there was no way he would ever be released from jail. Couzens also received an extra 19 months for a previous offense of indecent exposure. The judge who sentenced Couzens said that the murder of Sarah would have been prevented if the previous sexual offenses of Couzens had been taken seriously. Couzens was said to be shaking as his sentence was read, but video evidence was never provided. As a result of this brutal murder, the Met announced that they would stop deploying lone police officers in plain clothing. Wayne Couzens' case was shocking, but nothing will make you lose faith in the law enforcement agencies faster than the horrific actions of a group of cops called the Goon Squad.
In the last hour, 6 former Mississippi officers were sentenced to 15 to 45 years in prison on state charges in the assault and torture of 2 black men. The officers pleaded guilty to charges including hindering prosecution, burglary, home invasion, and aggravated assault.
These 6 men you just saw called themselves the Goon Squad, and it is shocking that such a name is used for a group of law enforcement officers. These 6 committed a series of crimes that would make your blood boil.
5 former deputies and 1 police officer entered this home, no warrant, no evidence that anything was happening there. And they proceeded to torture these men for hours using food, at one point a sex toy, and threatening an execution.
On January 24, 2023 in Mississippi, these 6 men brutally tortured 2 men named Michael Jenkins and Eddie Parker in some of the most heinous ways possible. Brett McAlpin, Hunter Elward, Christian Dedman, Jeffrey Middleton, Daniel Opdyke, and Joshua Hartfield tortured the men for over an hour and a half. The officers, who referred to themselves as the Goon Squad, went to the area after receiving a report that Jenkins and Parker had entered a home with a white woman. The home belonged to Christy Wally, a childhood friend of Parker who had been paralyzed, and Parker was her caretaker. The Goon Squad broke down the front door and immediately restrained Parker and Jenkins without a search warrant. Wally was in the hospital when this horrific incident happened. The Goon Squad referred to Jenkins and Parker with slurs and insults while beating and torturing the men. Opdyke found a sex toy in the house and forced it into Parker's mouth. Another of the officers, Christian Dedman, threatened to rape the men, and he attempted until he realized that Jenkins had defecated on himself. If you thought that was all, you're wrong. Elward held the 2 men down and watched as Dedman poured cooking oil, eggs, chocolate syrup, and milk, among other kitchen ingredients, on them. Hartfield also used a taser on the 2 men while they were tied up. Jenkins and Parker were beaten with a plank and a sword during the torture. After these horrible officers had their fill of torturing the 2 men, they ordered them to take a shower to hide the evidence of the torture they went through for almost 2 hours. Unfortunately for the victims, it wasn't over. Elward forced his gun into Jenkins' mouth and shot him even though he failed the first time. The bullet tore through the victim's mouth, broke his jaw, and came out of his neck. Before the Goon Squad left, they planted a gun and drugs in the home and accused Jenkins of trying to shoot at them first. They took security footage from the house and threw it into a river. The Goon Squad pleaded guilty to all counts of felonies, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice, among other counts. During the investigation, the lead attorney, Malik Shabazz, said that it was one of the worst things he had ever come across. The time for sentencing came, and it was a long and overdue process. Although the Goon Squad pleaded guilty in August 2022, they weren't sentenced until March 2024. The Goon Squad displayed a variety of reactions as their sentences were read. The man who was regarded as the mafia don of the group, Brett McAlpin, was sentenced to more than 27 years in prison, and his voice was said to be shaking as he addressed the court. The victims described him as a tyrant or a king because he walked around and instructed the other deputies on what to do while they were being tortured. The members of the Goon Squad also said that the squad would not even exist if it wasn't for McAlpin. He apologized for his actions, but it didn't count with the victims, because he had been the reason that the other members came to the Braxton home that day. Daniel Opdyke was sentenced to 17 years in prison, and while he addressed the court, he cried profusely and was very emotional as he delivered his speech. He apologized for sexually assaulting Jenkins, but the victim walked out of the courtroom with his aunt. He pleaded that the reason he was this way was because he had been sexually assaulted by his father until he was 8 years old. He was also responsible for handing over the evidence of the Goon Squad group chat on WhatsApp to the police. After apologizing, he was led away in chains as he wept out of the courtroom. Elward, who had shot Jenkins in the mouth, was sentenced to 20 years, and he also gave an emotional apology to the victims for shooting Jenkins and leaving him to bleed to death. Jeffrey Middleton was sentenced to 17.5 years for obstruction of justice and abuse of the victims. Joshua Hartfield was sentenced to 10 years because he participated in the torture. He was the only officer who wasn't a member of the Rankin County Sheriff's Department. The argument that was given was that the reason he participated was because he applied to work in Rankin. He used a taser on the victims and tried to destroy evidence. He choked and wept as he apologized for failing to help the people who needed him the most. The man who got the longest sentence was Christian Dedman. He was described as oppressive, sick, and the most sexually perverted of all the perpetrators for his actions. He threatened to rape the victims and poured multiple kitchen ingredients on them. Dedman was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He never addressed the victims directly, but he said that he would never forgive himself for the crimes he committed.
For, what, is given and what is done, I forgive that part, but other than that, he still did, what he did, and he has to be punished for that.
If I had to see them again, I would probably just start praying. I'd probably be scared out of my body.
The Goon Squad's reign of corruption and abuse revealed shocking misconduct within law enforcement, but the next case exposes an even deeper web of criminal activity.
A judge sentenced Sergeant Wayne Jenkins to 25 years in federal prison.
You have a gun in? Probably, I would say 2 1/4 just by looking at it.
Inside the Baltimore Police Department, a sinister underworld was thriving. 8 police officers were found to be running an organized crime ring. Their nefarious activities orchestrated by none other than Wayne Jenkins. Wayne Jenkins, the head of the Gun Trace Task Force, wasn't your typical cop. His name became synonymous with corruption. Planting evidence was just the beginning. He masterminded robberies and even stole drugs from looted pharmaceutical companies.
Newly released videos show the officers pretending to open a safe for the first time.
Hey, Sarge! Hey, come downstairs right quick. They're about to get it open.
But in fact, prosecutors say they'd already gotten in, took $100 grand for themselves, then pretended this was the first time they'd laid eyes on the cash.
The Gun Trace Task Force was established with a noble purpose, but under Wayne Jenkins, its mission was twisted beyond recognition. Instead of upholding the law, Jenkins and his crew became the very criminals they were supposed to apprehend. Robbing people at gunpoint, stealing and selling drugs, they raked in over $1 million. But the trail of devastation they'd left didn't stop at financial gain. It included a haunting human toll. Recovered body camera footage revealed a harrowing encounter. Jenkins and his team attempting to rob 2 men in a car. The victims, desperate to escape, sped off. Jenkins pursued relentlessly, crashing into their vehicle and causing the death of Elbert Davis. This reckless act not only shattered the lives of those directly involved, but also inflicted immeasurable pain on the victims' families, exposing the profound betrayal and corruption at the heart of Baltimore's police force. 7 years after the tragic incident, Davis's daughter was asked if she could ever trust the police again. Her response was poignant and revealing.
7 years later, we find out that corrupt cops who swore to protect and serve were nothing more than criminals. He apologized for it, Mr. Jenkins, but it still hurts.
But this is only part of the story. The real question is, how did years of organized crime go unnoticed within the police force? And how were they finally exposed? Surprisingly, the unraveling of this corrupt empire began with one man. His actions set off a chain of events that would eventually bring Jenkins and his crew to justice, revealing the extent of their betrayal. The turning point came with the conviction of a man who stole the that claimed a teenager's life. When the evidence was reviewed, wiretaps revealed a startling discovery. The voices of Wayne Jenkins and his 7 co-conspirators were heard repeatedly during the intercepted conversations. As investigators delved deeper, it became clear that the Gun Trace Task Force was entangled in far more than just rogue actions. They were key players in a sophisticated drug operation. It was uncovered that one of the task force members, Mamadou Gondo, had been providing protection to the drug crew, allowing them to expand their illegal enterprise into a lucrative million-dollar operation. This revelation was the linchpin that exposed the depths of the corruption and criminality that had infiltrated Baltimore's police force. In addition to the damning recordings, investigators uncovered irregularities in official records, suggesting tampering. With the overwhelming evidence piling up, the FBI had enough to arrest and indict the corrupt task force members. Wayne Jenkins was finally tried and sentenced to 25 years in prison on June 7, 2018. Witnesses described him crying during his sentencing, pleading with the judge for mercy. He had confided in his attorney that he couldn't face a life sentence because of his children. His lawyer noted Jenkins showed signs of remorse, reportedly telling the judge he was ashamed of his actions. This dramatic fall from grace marked the end of one of the most notorious corruption cases in Baltimore's history, bringing some measure of justice to the victims and their families. But it's hard not to show remorse when you're caught, so we're inclined not to believe Jenkins. But in the case of Marcus Eberhardt, it's even harder to believe.
Sergeant Eberhardt guilty on all counts and Corporal Weems guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reckless conduct, and oaths of office. Now, the two were accused of tasing 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death back in April of 2014.
This is Marcus Eberhardt, a former police officer from East Point, Michigan, who ignited a nationwide debate in 2014. Alongside fellow officer Howard Weems, Eberhardt tasered 24-year-old Gregory Towns to death. On April 11, 2014, the two officers responded to a domestic violence report from Towns' girlfriend, Aisha Smith. She had called the police, alleging that Towns had abused her, prompting Eberhardt and Weems to visit the house. According to testimony, Towns attempted to flee upon seeing the police. After being caught and handcuffed, Eberhardt instructed Towns to walk to the patrol car. Towns, claiming he was too exhausted to walk, refused. In response, Eberhardt and Weems used their tasers on him repeatedly until he became unresponsive. Their intention was to force Towns to comply, but their actions resulted in his death. The prosecution called the act a violation because, at the time Eberhardt and Weems tasered Towns, he was already handcuffed and struggling to breathe. Initially, the defense argued that it wasn't the taser that caused Towns' death, but an underlying health condition, a rare sickle cell trait, that coincidentally led to his unfortunate demise. Eberhardt was eventually charged with involuntary manslaughter and felony murder. This wasn't Eberhardt's first brush with controversy. Past records revealed a pattern of aggressive behavior. This case underscored the urgent need for reform in police practices and the importance of accountability in law enforcement. During the investigation, it was revealed that Eberhardt had used the taser on Towns for more than 40 seconds, far exceeding departmental policy limits. The defense argued that Eberhardt was unaware of Towns' health conditions and was simply following his training to subdue a resisting suspect. Despite these claims, the excessive use of the taser led to Marcus Eberhardt being charged for Towns' death. This case marked a significant moment in Michigan's history. It was the first time a police officer had been convicted of a crime for using a taser on an individual. Eberhardt was eventually sentenced in December 2016. During the verdict, where he was informed that he could be facing up to 15 years in prison, Eberhardt appeared indifferent, showing no emotion or reaction. As the judge read the sentence, Eberhardt seemed more interested in leaving the courthouse. His lawyer expressed disappointment in Eberhardt's conduct, but offered little else in terms of defense or remorse. This lack of response from Eberhardt further fueled public outrage and underscored the tragic impact of his actions on Gregory Towns and his family. Ultimately, Eberhardt was sentenced to life in prison for his actions. While no recorded statements were made during the sentencing, it was reported that he released a statement expressing remorse. In his statement, Eberhardt acknowledged the profound impact his actions had on Gregory Towns' girlfriend and child. He said, "I am truly sorry for the pain that I have caused the Marshall family. I am aware that nothing I can say or do can bring back their loved one, but I want them to know that I am taking full responsibility for my actions." This statement, while expressing remorse, did little to undo the damage and suffering caused by his excessive use of force. This case brought intense scrutiny to the use of force and aggression by police officers. For Towns' family, the conviction brought a measure of relief, knowing that Eberhardt was held accountable for his actions. Aisha Smith, Gregory Towns' girlfriend, expressed a personal struggle with the situation. She stated that she would work to forgive herself for calling Eberhardt and Weems to the house, despite the tragic outcome. Now we head to Australia, where a devoted cop who had associations with organized crime ring members.
There are people who believe that I'm the most corrupt, wicked, diabolical person in the world. I can never change their mind.
Roger Caleb Rogerson's story is a significant case of police corruption in Australia. During his tenure with the New South Wales Police Force, Rogerson was highly decorated, receiving 13 awards for his service, bravery, and performance. However, his reputation took a dramatic turn when his criminal activities were revealed, leading to his dismissal from the force in 1986. Rogerson's actions and the subsequent uncovering of his crimes made headlines for years, marking him as one of the most notorious figures in Australian law enforcement history. His case serves as a stark reminder of how corruption can undermine even the most respected institutions. The first indicator of something going on was Roger's association with other corrupt cops and organized crime ring members, including substance dealer and convicted substance dealer named Arthur Neddy Smith. Roger Rogerson's involvement in high-profile cases like the Toe Cutter Gang murder and the Whiskey A Go-Go fire initially bolstered his reputation. However, his descent into criminal behavior began to surface in 1981 with the shooting of Warren LaFranchi, a substance dealer. Smith's later claims that Rogerson had given him permission to commit multiple murders further tarnished Rogerson's legacy, highlighting the severe breaches of trust and corruption within the police force. The situation around Warren LaFranchi's death became even murkier, with claims that he had shot at a police officer during the incident. The case took a darker turn when a woman who had testified against Rogerson was later found murdered in a pond in Centennial Park.
Rogerson shooting dead 3 people in the line of duty, including drug dealer Warren LaFranchi in a Chippendale laneway in 1981.
I said, this bloke's going to shoot me. I knew he was going to pull the trigger, so I've fired twice, and he's fallen over and he's landed in the gutter.
Despite the mounting accusations and evidence against him, Rogerson remained on the police force and was never charged for the shooting of Warren LaFranchi. The situation escalated when, in 1984, Rogerson was allegedly involved in the shooting of fellow officer Michael Drury. Michael, who survived the attack, testified against Rogerson, claiming that he had refused a bribe to tamper with evidence in a case involving a convicted dealer working with Christopher Flannery, an associate of Rogerson. Alan Williams, the dealer in question, testified that Rogerson and Flannery had conspired to kill Drury, offering $50,000 each for the job. Despite these serious allegations and testimony, the charges were eventually dropped in 1989, leading to Rogerson's acquittal. Roger Rogerson's legal troubles continued despite multiple allegations and evidence against him. After being convicted of substance dealing and conspiring with dealer Dennis Allen, the appeal against these charges was dropped and Rogerson walked free. In November 1989, despite the charges being dropped, Rogerson was dismissed from active service duty to the Drury case. He was subsequently arrested in 1990 and sentenced to 9 months in prison for fabricating evidence. Rogerson's legal issues persisted, and in 2005, he and his wife, Anne Malocco, were arrested for perjury after lying to the Police Integrity Commission. Rogerson was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, but was released after serving 12 months due to good behavior.
Mr. Rogerson is being taken from the steps of his family home now. Mr. Rogerson, do you maintain your innocence?
Absolutely.
Do you maintain your innocence, sir?
We're back to the Gestapo days now.
The last trial Roger Rogerson faced was related to the murder of Jamie Gow, a 20-year-old student in 2014. The incident reportedly occurred after a drug deal involving Rogerson and former cop Glenn McNamara went awry. In March 2015, Rogerson and McNamara were charged with the murder of Jamie and the supply of nearly 3 kilograms of methamphetamine. The trial, however, was aborted the following day due to revelations of Rogerson's alleged involvement in multiple murders during his time in active service. Roger Rogerson's final trial, which began in February 2016, culminated with his sentencing to life in prison on September 2, 2016, for the murder of Jamie Gow. Despite attempts to appeal the sentence in 2020, Rogerson's appeal was denied, and he continued to serve his life sentence until 2024. On January 18, 2024, Rogerson suffered an aneurysm and was rushed to the hospital. He passed away on January 21st after being taken off life support. He was 83 years old. An investigation was launched into his death due to standard protocols for deaths occurring in police custody. Rogerson's notorious career and criminal activities were so well known that his story was dramatized in a miniseries broadcast in 1995. Roger Rogerson's legacy of corruption and criminal behavior highlighted the darkest side of law enforcement, but the next case shifts to a modern tale of betrayal of duty.
Official misconduct, fabricating evidence, false imprisonment, possession of controlled substances, and drug paraphernalia, and perjury. Wester joined the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in 2016, but it wasn't until 2018 that people started to question his actions.
Zachary Wester, whose father was a police officer, seemed destined for a successful career when he joined the Liberty County Sheriff's Office in 2015. However, within less than a year, he left Liberty County amid allegations of sexual misconduct. Despite these claims, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, located northwest of Tallahassee, hired him in 2016. At Jackson County, Wester quickly gained a reputation for his assertive and aggressive policing style. His high volume of drug arrests earned him recognition and respect within the department. Yet, as the summer of 2018 approached, investigators for the district attorney began to uncover troubling discrepancies in Wester's police reports and body camera footage. Zachary Wester's misconduct came to light when body camera footage revealed him holding a plastic baggie in his hand before searching a woman's vehicle, whom he later arrested for possession. This suspicious behavior prompted a thorough investigation into his actions. When investigators searched Wester's patrol vehicle, they uncovered ready-to-plant substances and paraphernalia in the trunk. Prosecutors argued that this evidence proved Wester had been carrying substances he used to plant on victims during traffic stops. The incriminating discovery led to Wester's suspension from duty in 2019. Later that year, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement completed its investigation, resulting in his arrest. Following his arrest, prosecutors were compelled to drop charges in over 100 cases involving Webster from his 2 years with the Jackson County Sheriff's Department. One of the pivotal witnesses in Zachary Wester's trial was Teresa Odom, a victim of his misconduct. In 2018, Zachary stopped Teresa for a broken brake light and requested to search her truck. Despite her initial reluctance, Teresa consented to the search. To her shock, Zachary claimed to have found a bag of in her purse. Teresa adamantly denied having any drugs, but to avoid a protracted legal fight, she ultimately pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 4 years probation. Her conviction was later overturned once it was revealed that she was a victim of Zachary's deceitful practices. The defense tried to paint Zachary Wester as a dedicated family man and upstanding member of his community, emphasizing his regular church attendance and charitable contributions. His wife, Rebecca, begged for leniency, describing Zachary as a fundamentally good person who had simply made mistakes. Yet, the overwhelming evidence presented in court revealed that his actions were not just isolated errors, but part of a broader pattern of corruption. Zachary Wester was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in prison. The impact of his actions was profound, affecting numerous individuals and the community at large. In a measure of justice, the victims of Zachary's misconduct were awarded a $1 million settlement. This compensation seeks to address the harm and suffering caused by Wester's corruption, serving as a partial remedy for the extensive damage inflicted by his fraudulent conduct. What's worse than a single corrupt cop? An entire specialized unit of them. And that's exactly what the next case will expose.
Desmond Mills pled guilty to excessive force and conspiracy to witness tampering today. He's now facing 15 years in prison. He's expected also to plead guilty to several other charges.
Desmond Mills joined the Memphis Police Department in March 2017. and quickly became part of the Scorpion Unit, a specialized predictive policing team. Scorpion, which stands for Street Crimes Operation to Restore Peace in Our Neighborhoods, was designed to utilize advanced data analysis and statistical algorithms to protect and prevent crime in targeted areas. Unlike traditional officers, the Scorpion Unit members, including Desmond Mills, operated in plain clothes and wore bulletproof vests labeled police. Their unmarked vehicles and covert operational methods allowed them to blend into their surroundings, making their presence less conspicuous to the public. This undercover approach was intended to enhance their effectiveness in identifying and addressing criminal activity discreetly. On January 7, 2023, Desmond Mills and 4 other officers from the Scorpion Unit stopped Tyre Nichols, a 29-year-old African-American FedEx worker and amateur photographer. At 8:24 p.m., just 2 minutes from his home, Tyre found himself in the midst of a harrowing encounter that would tragically alter his life. The encounter began with the officers pulling Tyre from his car and throwing him to the ground. As they tased him and issued threats, another officer further escalated the situation by deploying pepper spray into Tyre's face, intensifying his pain and confusion. Despite their efforts to subdue him, Tyre managed to break free and fled, prompting the officers to give chase. The situation escalated when the officers caught up with Tyre Nichols. What followed was a brutal and unrelenting assault. Desmond Mills, armed with his baton, delivered merciless blows to Tyre, while another officer pummeled him in the face. A third officer joined in, kicking Tyre's torso with force, causing severe injuries. Throughout this ordeal, Tyre's desperate cries for his mother pierced the night, but no one came to his aid, leaving him to endure the relentless beating alone. Paramedics arrived at the scene and Tyre was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Despite medical efforts, he succumbed to his injuries 3 days later, leaving behind a devastated family and a community grappling with shock and sorrow. Tyre's family attorney has accused the police officers of torturing Tyre to death, an allegation that has prompted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to launch a probe into the excessive use of force during his arrest. 2 weeks after the tragic death of Tyre Nichols, on January 24, 2023, the Department of Justice and the FBI announced that they would open a civil rights investigation into the case. This decision heightened the scrutiny of the officers involved and added a layer of federal oversight to the local investigation. In the days that followed, the 5 officers implicated in Tyre's death were placed on administrative leave and subsequently fired from the Memphis Police Department. Their terminations marked the end of their careers in law enforcement. The investigations culminated in the arrest of Officer Desmond Mills and his 4 colleagues, who faced serious charges including second-degree murder, aggravated assault, kidnapping, official misconduct, and oppression. Despite the gravity of these charges, all 5 officers were granted bail and released shortly after their arrests. The Scorpion Unit, the task force to which they belonged, was disbanded in the wake of the scandal. In November 2023, Desmond Mills pleaded guilty to the state charges as part of an agreement with federal prosecutors. Desmond agreed to testify against the other 4 officers at their trials as part of the plea agreement. The prosecution recommended a 15-year sentence for Desmond. However, Desmond's sentencing hearing, originally scheduled to be held in May 2024, was postponed until November. He will be free until then.
Newman, Con, Roger, defendant, verdict. We, the jury, find as follows. As to count 1, we find a defendant guilty of manslaughter while armed with a firearm as charged in the information.
Newman Raja, a Pakistani-American who became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 2001, had long harbored ambitions of following in his grandfather's footsteps, who had served as a police chief in Pakistan. After working in a small Florida police department, Raja joined the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department in 2013. On October 18, 2015, Corey Jones, an employee of the Delray Beach Housing Authority, faced a troubling predicament. After a performance with his band, Corey's car broke down on Interstate 94. Desperate for help, he called his bandmate, who arrived with oil and tried to fix the issue. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to get the car running again. Corey called for a tow truck and saw his bandmate leave, believing he would be safe until help arrived. However, Corey's night was about to take a tragic turn. Newman Raja, working undercover in an unmarked white van with tinted windows, came upon Corey's broken-down vehicle. Raja was engaged in burglary surveillance at the time. He later claimed that Corey, who was reportedly armed, confronted him, forcing him to use his weapon. Newman fired 6 shots, hitting Corey with 3 of them. One bullet struck a major blood vessel near Corey's heart, causing fatal injuries. The other 2 bullets hit Corey in his left elbow and right shoulder, fracturing his arm. At the time of the shooting, Newman was not wearing a body camera, and his van lacked a dash cam, leaving critical details of the incident unrecorded. Internal affairs at the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department quickly launched an investigation into the shooting, leading to Newman Raja being placed on administrative leave and eventually terminated from his position. On June 1, 2016, a grand jury charged Newman with manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder with a firearm. The state attorney's office of Palm Beach County argued that Newman acted improperly by opening fire on Corey Jones without identifying himself as a police officer. They contended that Newman's actions were unjustified and directly resulted in Corey's death. Following his arrest, Newman was released on bond and placed under house arrest. His release came with conditions, including surrendering his passport and wearing an ankle monitor to track his movements. In March 2019, Newman Raja was found guilty of manslaughter and attempted first-degree murder after a week-long trial. The jury determined that Newman had recklessly caused Corey Jones's death and attempted to kill him with a firearm. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison in April 2019. Following the trial, Corey's family pursued a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Palm Beach Gardens. They argued that the city's negligence allowed Newman to serve as a police officer despite his misconduct, contributing to Corey's death. In 2023, Corey's family and the city reached a $2 million settlement, providing some measure of justice for the loss they endured. Newman Raja's actions raised serious questions about accountability and justice within law enforcement, but the next case takes betrayal to an even more personal level.
Blue is charged on 4 counts including first-degree premeditated murder in the strangulation death of Jenny Webb, the Bridgeport woman bearing his unborn child.
In 2012, Jennifer Webb, a 30-year-old administrative assistant from Michigan, made an exciting discovery. She was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and anticipation, especially when the sonogram test revealed that she was going to have a little boy. Jennifer promptly shared her happiness with her mother, calling her in tears to announce her plans to name her unborn son James or Braxton. Despite the joyous news, Jennifer's pregnancy faced one important challenge. The father of the child was not involved, and she had concerns about whether she had shared the news with his wife. Jennifer believed it was crucial for the baby's birth certificate to include the birth father's name, and she felt the man's wife ought to know beforehand. Wanting to address these concerns, Jennifer planned to meet with the baby's father on the evening of August 30th. That night, Jennifer was annoyed by the impending meeting. However, she ultimately decided to go anyway, a decision that would change her life forever. At around midnight, 2 police officers with the Buena Vista Township Police Department, one of them being Kenneth Blue, stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. As they approached the rural dead-end road, they found Jennifer lying on the ground. Upon closer inspection, the officers noticed a peculiar sight. A long cord was attached to the roof rack of Jennifer's car and extended down the ditch to where her body lay. Even more chilling was the fact that the cord was wrapped tightly around her neck. Recognizing the severity of the situation, the detectives wasted no time launching an investigation. They quickly secured the crime scene and began searching for clues that could shed light on what happened to Jennifer. One of the detectives stumbled upon a note written by Jennifer. The note revealed her thoughts on taking her own life. It stated that she had struggled with the idea of being pregnant for several months and had finally admitted to herself that she was not okay with the situation. When the detectives questioned Jennifer's mother, she dropped a bombshell. The father of Jennifer's baby was Kenneth Blue, one of the police officers who found Jennifer's body. This revelation sparked a chain of events that led the detectives to uncover new details about the case. As the investigation continued, the detectives stumbled upon messages between Jennifer and Kenneth Blue on Jennifer's cell phone. These messages provided further insight into their relationship and revealed their intimate connection. Moreover, when they examined Jennifer's call log, the detectives noticed the last person she had contact with was Kenneth. In order to determine the manner of Jennifer's death, a forensic pathologist was called in. The pathologist's findings contradicted the initial assumption that an extension cord strangled Jennifer. Instead, the pathologist determined that Jennifer may have been placed in a chokehold from behind and died as a result of neck compression.
She died of the suffocation. We call it chokehold.
This new information cast doubt on the initial crime scene analysis, indicating that the death may not have been as straightforward as initially thought. During an interview with Kenneth Blue, the detectives noticed several injuries on the officer's body. There were noticeable injuries to his eye, forearm, and index finger. When the DNA results of the paternity of Jennifer's unborn baby confirmed the father was Officer Kenneth Blue, the detectives wasted no time in arresting him and charging him with Jennifer and her unborn son's murder. In 2012, Kenneth Blue went on trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Additionally, he was given an extra 65 to 100-year sentence for the death of his unborn son. During Jennifer's mother's victim impact statement, she had the opportunity to address Kenneth Blue directly. With a mix of anger and sadness, she said,
"Go to your cage and think about how you squeezed the life and breath out of my daughter and grandson, and I hope it haunts you every day for the rest of your life."
It's unimaginable to think that a father and New York City police officer could ever abuse their young son so badly that it would ultimately result in the child's death. However, that is exactly what happened to Officer Michael Valva.
The slight boy with hazel eyes who loved school was beaten and starved.
Thomas lived as a prisoner, given a death sentence that was executed. While this defendant will have a cell with a bed and a blanket and a pillow and heat.
In 2022, a Long Island, New York jury convicted a former New York City police officer with the second-degree murder of his 8-year-old autistic son, Thomas Valva. During the trial, it was revealed that the principal and teachers of Thomas Elementary School, where Thomas attended 3rd grade, had made over 24 calls to Child Protective Services in the 3 years before the child's death. Testimony during the trial revealed that Thomas's teachers had repeatedly raised concerns about his physical well-being. They testified that on several occasions, Thomas and his brothers arrived at school covered in bruises. The extent of the injuries raised concerns among staff members, who suspected that the children were being abused. Furthermore, several school staff members described instances where they witnessed Thomas eating crumbs off the floor and out of the trash. Additionally, it came to light that Thomas wore pull-ups all day, despite being 8 years old, which was made due to his incontinence, believed to be caused by the stress of not using the bathroom for long periods while at home. According to the prosecution, Michael Valva abused his son for several years before January 17, 2020, when Thomas ultimately went into cardiac arrest and died due to hypothermia. On the night of January 17th, Thomas and his brother, also autistic, were locked in the garage at their Long Island home. The garage lacked proper insulation and was unheated, making it extremely cold. At around 8 a.m., Thomas, confined to the freezing garage, soiled himself. Based on security camera footage and audio records, Michael Valva can be heard telling his fiancée, Angela Polina, to make the 8-year-old boy eat his feces. Michael Valva verbally berated Thomas, cursing him for soiling his pants before school. He ordered Thomas to strip down so he could hose him off in the yard before school with cold water. One of the Valva family's neighbors' security camera footage caught Thomas losing his balance and falling, hitting his head as he walked down an icy path after Michael hosed him off in the yard. Minutes after the fall, at around 8:50 a.m., Michael Valva took his son back to the garage. The recordings revealed alarming statements by Michael to his fiancée. He can be heard stating that Thomas was catatonic and needed help. Michael then proceeded to slap his son repeatedly, yelling, "Wake up! Are you alive?" The security cameras captured these actions. Despite witnessing his son's condition, Michael did not seek immediate medical attention. Instead, he tried to wake Thomas, who was unresponsive. After failing to revive his son through a warm bath, Michael Valva finally made the call at 9:40 a.m. to report Thomas's condition. The ambulance arrived promptly and transported Thomas to the hospital. However, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate, and upon his arrival, his temperature was only 76.1 degrees. Tragically, less than 1 hour later, Thomas passed away. The medical reports revealed severe hypothermia, which experts believe was caused by prolonged exposure to cold temperatures. Michael Valva's actions were deemed reprehensible, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
It's God that I did not want my son to die.
Come here today and see an end to it.
We wanted to make sure that this man got the absolute biggest sentence he could under the law.
During Michael Valva's trial, the prosecution showed extensive surveillance footage from inside the home, and the prosecutors asserted Thomas and his brother had been abused for years. The Suffolk County District Attorney who tried the case referred to it as heartbreaking and one of the toughest cases he has experienced in his 30 years as a prosecutor. Several staff members from Thomas's elementary school testified to the conditions they witnessed Thomas come to school in. Amber Geiger, a white former police officer, entered an apartment she believed was hers, but instead she found 26-year-old Botham John, a black man, inside. What happened next would ignite a firestorm of controversy and spark a nationwide debate about race and policing in the United States.
I'm an off-duty officer. I thought it was in my apartment, and I shot a guy thinking it was my apartment.
Amber Geiger, a police officer with the Dallas Police Department, lived in a 4-story apartment complex located 2 blocks northwest of her police headquarters in the Cedars district of South Dallas. The floor plans at the complex were identical on every floor, making navigation within the building challenging. On September 6, 2018, Amber Geiger left work after her 13.5-hour shift as a patrol officer around 9:30 p.m. As she was driving home, she engaged in a conversation with her partner. She was armed with her handgun during this time, but her body camera was not turned on. Upon arriving at her apartment complex, Amber failed to notice that she had taken the wrong floor. As Amber attempted to enter what she thought was her apartment, she saw the door was ajar, thinking it was an intruder. Amber drew her weapon and entered the apartment. Once inside, Amber encountered Botham John in his living room, eating ice cream. In a tragic turn of events, Amber shot and killed Botham, striking him twice in the chest. Amber Geiger called 911 to report the shooting.
Get up, man.
Dallas 911, this is Carla. Where's your emergency?
Hi, this is an off-duty officer. I need EMS. I'm inside the apartment with him. Hey, come on.
What's your name?
I'm Amber Geiger. I need to get me, I'm in...
Okay, we have help on the way.
I know, but I'm gonna lose my job.
Botham John was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, he succumbed to his injuries and died. 3 days later, Amber was arrested and charged with manslaughter. However, the charge was later upgraded to murder following further investigation. In the aftermath of the shooting, Amber was placed on administrative leave by the Dallas Police Department. However, on September 24, 2018, she was fired. The firing resulted from her violation of department policies regarding the use of force and entry without consent.
But there is much more to be done by the city of Dallas.
Amber Geiger's trial began on September 23, 2019. She took the stand in her own defense, recounting the events that led to her shooting of Botham John and testifying that she feared for her life and thought Botham John was an intruder in her apartment. Both the prosecution and defense presented expert witnesses who testified about the use of force, split-second decision-making, and self-defense. After deliberating for about an hour, the jury returned with a guilty verdict against Amber Geiger on October 1, 2019. The following day, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison for her role in Botham's murder. During the sentencing phase of the trial, Botham John's mother, Allison John, provided an emotional testimony, sharing the impact her son's death had on her life and her family. Botham's younger brother, Brant John, also took the stand, expressing his forgiveness for Amber and even hugging her in the courtroom. Although Botham's father did forgive Amber, he wanted her to be stiffer.
Somebody told her that Botham was shot and that he died. My life has not been the same. It's just been like a roller coaster. I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. It's just been the most terrible time for me.
But I love you just like anyone else. I'm not gonna say I hope you rot and die. And I wasn't gonna ever say this in front of my family or anyone, but I don't even want you to go to jail.
Amber Geiger's appeal has been denied, which means that her sentence will stand as decided by the courts. She is still eligible for release as early as September 2024. On the other hand, her full sentence will continue to run until September 2029. The Amber Geiger trial sparked conversations and debates about racial profiling, police brutality, and criminal justice in the United States. Critics argued that Amber's conviction was a rare example of accountability in a system that often favors officers in use of force cases. Supporters of Amber expressed concerns about the potential for vigilantism if officers were discouraged from exercising their right to defend themselves. Whereas some argue Amber Geiger killed Botham John accidentally, There is no doubting that Michael Dotro's actions were driven by pure hatred.
The sentence to be imposed in this particular case is because Mr. Dotro, through his conduct and his admissions, spanning from 1998 to this year, represents the worst that we can possibly expect from someone in our society.
Michael Dotro, a police officer, harbored deep resentment towards his superior deputy chief, Mark Anderko. He was frustrated by the chief's decision to rearrange his shift times and order him to undergo an evaluation with a clinical psychologist, following the 11th excessive force complaint against him. In retaliation, Michael Dotro decided to take matters into his own hands. Late at night, as Mark Anderko and his family slept peacefully in their home, Michael Dotro carried out a chilling act of violence. Michael intentionally firebombed Mark's home, causing extensive damage to the property. Miraculously, everyone managed to escape alive, narrowly avoiding what could have been a tragic loss of life. Michael Dotro was arrested and taken into custody, facing an array of criminal charges. He had been accused of cyberbullying a woman who worked in the police department, slashing her tires, using the department's computer to access information illegally, and possessing marijuana and paraphernalia in his police bag. Furthermore, it was discovered that Michael had prohibited weapons in his possession, including a blackjack and brass knuckles. The prosecutor at Michael Dotro's trial delivered a powerful opening statement, calling the defendant's actions a disgrace to the oath he took as a police officer. According to the prosecution, during the hearing, Michael showed no remorse and offered no apology to his former superior, Mark Anderko, whose entire family was victimized. During the sentencing hearing, the judge handed down a stringent punishment. Michael was sentenced to 20 years for attempted murder and 10 years in prison for aggravated arson. Additionally, he received 10 years for official misconduct, 5 years for conspiracy to tamper with a witness, and 18 months for conspiracy to retaliate. These sentences were to be served consecutively, meaning Michael would first serve 17 years before being eligible for parole. Additionally, Michael was ordered to serve 5 years probation upon his release. One day in his sentencing hearing, Michael's wife made a shocking statement to the courtroom. She referred to Michael as a manipulative monster before a sheriff officer instructed her to be quiet. When it comes to dirty cops, there is no doubt Michael Dotro is one of the worst of the worst. While he never killed anyone, the same can't be said about Jeffrey Morland.
Several people took the stand today, including Carrick Joe Roberts' husband and the detective who described to the jury the red flags that he knew pointed to murder.
On November 5, 2008, Carrick Joe Roberts, a happily married woman with 2 children, was discovered fatally shot in her home. The scene was gruesome, as Kara had been assaulted before her murder. Her killer had meticulously planned the killing, leaving Kara's body in the bathtub with the water running. An investigation into Kara's murder was swiftly launched, but the case soon became a cold one. The police, fearing there was a serial killer stalking the streets, grew concerned that the person who murdered Kara would strike again. Their fears were justified, as 2 years later, in October 2010, another heinous crime occurred. In October 2010, Paige Huser went to check on her 75-year-old mother, Nina Whitley, after not hearing from her for a while. When Paige entered her mother's home, she found Nina dead at the bottom of the stairs. Initially, Paige believed that her mother must have died from a heart attack and accidentally fallen down the stairs. However, upon the arrival of the police and upon turning Nina's body over, it was evident that her death was not of natural causes. Nina had sustained several stab wounds to her chest, and there were indications that she had been assaulted. Police officers began canvassing the neighborhood where Nina lived, seeking any clues or witness accounts that might help them identify the killer. One resident who had seen a white male in his 50s walking with a limp and driving a black Jeep near Nina's house on the day of her murder provided valuable information to the police. This witness was able to give a detailed description of the man, which assisted the police sketch artist in creating a likeness of the suspect. DNA evidence recovered from Nina's body was sent to the crime lab for analysis. Although detectives failed to find a suspect, the DNA did match the DNA found at the crime scene of Carrick Joe Roberts in 2008. Initially, Nina's daughter, Paige, did not recognize the suspect in the composite sketch. However, one day, while passing by a billboard displaying the police sketch, Paige's recognition hit her. The person depicted in the sketch was none other than her former boyfriend, Jeffrey Morland. Paige and Jeffrey dated for 3 years after meeting in a criminal justice course in college, but their relationship ended in 1987. Since their breakup, Jeffrey pursued a career in law enforcement. He became a police officer and eventually retired in 2005. The detectives quickly realized the significance of Page's revelation and began investigating Jeffrey Morland as a suspect in Nina's murder. One of the key discoveries they made was that Jeffrey owned a black Jeep, the same color as the vehicle driven by the suspect at the time of the crime. This evidence further solidified their suspicions and prompted them to seek a DNA sample from Jeffrey himself. Jeffrey seemed reluctant to provide a DNA sample, delaying the request from the detectives. However, as the investigation progressed, Jeffrey found himself facing allegations of sexual assault. This turn of events provided an opportunity for the detectives to obtain Jeffrey's DNA through other means. Once the DNA was analyzed, it was found to match the unknown male DNA found at both Nina Whitney's and Kara Jo Roberts' crime scenes. This development strengthened the case against Jeffrey Morland, as it provided a direct link between him and both the murders. Jeffrey Morland was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder and sexual assault. He faced trial and was ultimately found guilty on all counts. As a result, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Although it is clear Jeffrey Morland is a police officer and a cold-blooded murderer, the next case isn't quite so clear-cut. Is former California Highway Patrol officer Tamika Johnson a victim of domestic violence or a callous murderer?
That CHP officer is behind bars, charged with murdering her husband.
Tamika Johnson, a California Highway Patrol officer, found herself in a tragic situation in February 2009 when she shot and killed her husband, Marcus Lemons, while on a freeway exit ramp. After the shooting, Tamika drove to her parents' home with Marcus's body in the front seat of her car. When questioned by detectives, Tamika provided them with a detailed account of what led to the incident. According to Tamika, she and her husband started their night out at TGI Fridays, but an argument soon erupted. Tamika stated that she took the car keys and started to drive home, attempting to ignore the escalating tensions between her and Marcus. However, Marcus became enraged when she ignored him, grabbing her neck. Tamika claimed she pulled over on the freeway, hoping to calm down and defuse the situation. However, the struggle continued as Marcus took the keys out of the ignition, and a fight over Tamika's purse ensued. Tamika believed that Marcus was going for the gun she carried in her bag, and in self-defense, she managed to get hold of the weapon and shoot Marcus. However, after a thorough investigation, the detectives came to the conclusion that Tamika's story was not one of self-defense. Instead, they suspected it was cold-blooded murder. 2 years after her husband's death, Tamika Johnson was arrested and charged with murder. She pleaded not guilty and was held on a $2 million bail as she awaited trial. Due to her arrest, Tamika was placed on administrative leave without pay from her position as a California Highway Patrol officer. During Tamika's trial, her defense attorneys attempted to present her as a victim of domestic violence, not as someone who committed a callous act of murder. However, the prosecution countered these claims by presenting evidence that Tamika had exhibited aggressive tendencies and a tendency to drink excessively. Additionally, the prosecution painted the victim, Marcus, as a kind and peaceful man. Tamika took the witness stand to testify in her defense, but her statements did little to sway the jury. The jury ultimately found her guilty of first-degree murder, sentencing her to 50 years to life in prison. After the verdict was read, Tamika slid out of her chair behind the defense table and onto the floor. She was handcuffed to a gurney rail by her left wrist and removed from the courtroom as her family wailed and sobbed. Tamika Johnson's case of domestic turmoil and deadly violence shocked many, but the next story takes us to one of the most infamous serial predators in history. For years, he was a ghost, a phantom that haunted California, leaving a trail of terror, violence, and unanswered questions. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., better known as the Golden State Killer, committed at least 13 murders and 50 across California between 1974 and 1986. His crimes went unsolved for decades, becoming one of America's most notorious cold cases. DeAngelo's reign of terror began in the mid-1970s in Visalia, California. Known then as the Visalia Ransacker, he would break into homes, vandalize personal property, and steal small items. But his crimes quickly escalated. By 1976, he had moved to the Sacramento area, where he became known as the East Area. His modus operandi was chilling. He would stalk his victims, often entering their homes beforehand to unlock windows or plant ligatures. Then, in the dead of night, he would strike. D'Angelo would wake his victims with a flashlight beam and threats of violence. He often tied up male victims and stacked dishes on their backs, warning them that if he heard the dishes fall, he'd kill everyone in the house. He would then violate the female victims, sometimes repeatedly, over hours.
He preyed on people in Carmichael, Citrus Heights, and Rancho Cordova, often targeting couples. While raping the women, he would psychologically torture their husbands, tying them up and placing dishes on their back, threatening them not to move.
As fear gripped Sacramento, D'Angelo's attacks became bolder. He began targeting couples using the same tactics of binding, threats, and assaults. In 1978, he committed his first known murders, killing Brian and Katie Maggiore in Rancho Cordova. D'Angelo then moved his hunting grounds south to the Santa Barbara area, where he became known as the original Night Stalker. Here, his violence escalated further. He murdered at least 8 more people between 1979 and 1986, including couples in their homes. One of his most brutal attacks occurred in 1980 when he murdered Charlene and Lyman Smith in their Ventura County home. Charlene was violated before both were bludgeoned to death with a fireplace log. For years, investigators didn't connect these crimes. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were thought to be separate offenders. It wasn't until DNA testing in 2001 that authorities realized they were dealing with a single perpetrator. The case went cold for decades. D'Angelo, a former police officer, seemed to vanish into thin air after 1986. Victims lived in fear, never knowing if their attacker would return. Families of the murdered were left without closure, their loved ones' cases unsolved. Then, in 2018, a breakthrough came. Investigators used DNA from a crime scene and uploaded it to a genealogy website. This led them to distant relatives of the killer. Through painstaking work, they narrowed their search and finally identified Joseph D'Angelo as their suspect.
A breakthrough in 2018. Law enforcement plugged DNA material taken from a crime scene into a website called GEDmatch, which compares the genealogical data of family members.
On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested in his home in Citrus Heights, California. The man who had eluded capture for over 40 years was finally in custody. DNA evidence conclusively linked him to multiple crime scenes.
On April 24, 2018, police arrested Joseph James D'Angelo.
The arrest sent shockwaves through California and the true crime community. The Golden State Killer, a boogeyman who had haunted the state for decades, now had a face, a name, and a backstory that seemed jarringly ordinary. As details of D'Angelo's life emerged, the contrast was stark. He had worked as a police officer in Exeter and Auburn, California during the 1970s. He had been married, raised 3 daughters, and lived a seemingly normal life in the same area he had once terrorized. But on August 21, 2020, the day of reckoning finally arrived. D'Angelo, now a 74-year-old man, stood in a makeshift courtroom in Sacramento State University's ballroom, converted due to the COVID-19 precautions. The air was thick with tension as survivors and family members of his victims gathered to witness justice being served. As the proceedings began, the weight of D'Angelo's crimes became evident. Prosecutor Tien Ho painted a chilling picture of the man before them.
His monikers reflect the sweeping geographical impact of his crimes. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer.
But it was the victims' impact statements that truly brought home the horror of D'Angelo's actions. For 3 days, survivors and family members took the stand, their voices trembling with emotion as they recounted their experiences. One survivor, Chris Pedretti, who was violated by D'Angelo when she was just 15, looked him in the eye and declared,
"I was a normal 15-year-old kid. I loved going to school, having sleepovers, and going to church."
Another victim, Patty Cosper, daughter of survivor Patricia Murphy, read a statement on her mother's behalf. "May he rot in hell," Cosper spat, her voice filled with decades of pain and anger. As the statements continued, a pattern emerged. D'Angelo's victims weren't just recounting their trauma, they were reclaiming their power. Each statement seemed to chip away at the monster's facade, revealing the coward beneath. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Judge Michael Bowman prepared to deliver the sentence. The courtroom held its breath. Would the punishment fit the crime? Could any sentence truly bring justice after so many years? Judge Bowman's voice rang out, clear and firm.
Another way to state
The sentence is as follows. Mr. D'Angelo is sentenced to a total of 11 life without the possibility of parole sentences, plus an additional life sentence, plus an additional 8 years.
The reaction was immediate. A collective exhale swept through the room, followed by muffled sobs and whispers. Some victims clasped hands, others nodded solemnly. The monster who had haunted their nightmares for so long was finally caged. But the most surprising reaction came from D'Angelo himself. The man who had terrorized so many, who had eluded capture for decades, now sat slumped in his wheelchair. As the judge read out his crimes, D'Angelo's face remained impassive, almost bored. It was a stark contrast to the predator he once was. Then, in a move that stunned the courtroom, D'Angelo slowly rose from his wheelchair. He turned to face the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had hurt. For a moment, it seemed like he might finally show remorse, offer an explanation, or beg for forgiveness. Instead, in a barely audible voice, he uttered just 5 words.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry.
The reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a final insult, a half-hearted apology that couldn't begin to make up for the pain he'd caused. Others felt a sense of closure, finally hearing the killer acknowledge his crimes, even if only briefly. As D'Angelo was wheeled out of the courtroom to begin his life sentence, the atmosphere shifted. The monster was gone, but his legacy of pain remained. Yet there was also a sense of triumph. The survivors had faced their tormentor and emerged victorious. In the days following the sentencing, reactions continued to pour in. Law enforcement officials who had worked tirelessly on the case for years expressed relief and satisfaction. Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert called it the most prolific serial predator in California history, emphasizing the significance of the conviction. But perhaps the most poignant reactions came from the survivors themselves. Many spoke of a weight being lifted, of finally being able to close a chapter that had been left open for far too long.
No 13-year-old should have to find out what a rape kit is.
It had been all over the local news about the man they called the Visalia ransacker, who was breaking into people's houses, going through underwear drawers, and taking items of no value. I could never imagine that the man who had been stalking me and peering in my bedroom window during the previous months would end up changing my life forever.
He ate from my refrigerator and he drank 2 beers, while I lay bound and blindfolded, unclothed and freezing on the hardwood floor in front of an open door in the cold March night.
Joseph D'Angelo's decades-long reign of terror left countless lives shattered, but the next case brings us to a tragic encounter fueled by a failure of duty.
Would we want more time? Yes. Yes, we would. But that's what the jury decided, and, we're going to have to, take that with us. 11 years, that's the same age as Zion. 10 months, 12 days. That's the day that it happened.
Outside, Aaron Dean, a police officer, responds to a neighbor's call about an open front door. The neighbor, James Smith, had called a non-emergency police number, concerned because he noticed Jefferson's doors were open and lights were on at an unusual hour.
Neighbor James Smith called the non-emergency police line around 2 a.m. when he noticed the home's front and side doors were open with the lights on.
Dean arrives at the scene with his partner. Instead of knocking on the front door or announcing their presence, they begin to check the perimeter of the house. This decision would prove fatal. As Dean moves around the house, he spots movement through a window. In a split second, he draws his weapon and fires a single shot. The bullet pierces through the window, striking Atatiana Jefferson in the chest. She falls to the ground, dying in front of her young nephew. The aftermath is chaos. Dean's body camera footage reveals the crucial moments. He never identifies himself as a police officer. The entire encounter, from Dean seeing movement to firing his weapon, lasts a mere 3 seconds. Immediately after the shooting, Dean resigns from the Fort Worth Police Department. 2 days later, he's arrested and charged with murder. The case sends shockwaves through the community and ignites nationwide discussions about police use of force and racial bias in law enforcement. As more details emerge, the complexity of the case deepens. Investigators find a gun near Atatiana's body. Her family later confirms she owned the weapon legally and kept it for protection. This detail becomes a pivotal point in the upcoming trial. The case also brings attention to Dean's background. Records show he had been on the force for only 18 months. During his police academy training, he had received an unsatisfactory evaluation that noted his tunnel vision and need for improvement in stress reactions.
During the hiring process, also during that training in 2018, a supervising sergeant stated that when Dean was asked something by his training officer that he, quote, continues to avoid or ignore what's being said or asked.
In the weeks following the shooting, protests erupted across Fort Worth. Activists demand justice for Atatiana, holding vigils and marches. The case becomes a rallying cry in the broader movement against police brutality and racial injustice. The Jefferson family files a wrongful death lawsuit against the city and Dean. They argue that the Fort Worth Police Department's policies and training were inadequate, contributing to Atatiana's death. As the case moves towards trial, legal experts debate the charges. Some argue that murder is appropriate, given Dean's actions. Others contend that manslaughter might be more fitting, considering the split-second nature of the decision. The trial is delayed multiple times, first due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then because of various legal motions. Each delay adds to the tension and anticipation surrounding the case. Finally, in December 2022, more than 3 years after the shooting, Aaron Dean faces trial. The courtroom is packed as the proceedings begin, with observers eager to see how this high-profile case would unfold. Fast forward to December 2022. The tension in the air is thick as Aaron Dean finally faces trial. The prosecution paints a picture of a trigger-happy cop who acted recklessly. They argue that Dean failed to follow proper police procedure, resulting in an unnecessary death. But the defense attorney has a different story. They claim Dean acted in self-defense, believing Atatiana was armed and posed a threat. They argue that in the heat of the moment, Dean made a split-second decision to protect himself and his partner. As the trial unfolds, shocking details emerge. Body cam footage shows Dean peering through the window, shouting, "Put your hands up, show me your hands," before firing, all in a matter of seconds.
Put your hands up! Show me your hands!
The jury watches in stunned silence as the events of that fateful night play out before their eyes. Witnesses take the stand, each adding another piece to the puzzle. Dean's former police academy instructor testifies that Dean's actions were out of line with his training. He states emphatically that officers are taught to announce their presence when conducting a wellness check. But perhaps the most heart-wrenching testimony comes from Zion Carr, Atatiana's nephew. Now 11 years old, he recounts the terrifying moments when his aunt was shot. His words paint a vivid picture of a fun night turned tragic in an instant.
She didn't point it out, she just kept it next to her, like on her side.
And where did she go with that, after she picked up the gun?
She was about to start walking to the window. I didn't hear nothing after that, I just seen her fell on the floor.
As the trial progresses, the courtroom becomes a battleground of emotions. Atatiana's family sits stoically, their pain evident in every line of their faces. Dean, on the other hand, remains impassive, his expression unreadable as he listens to the testimony against him. The prosecution hammers home their point. Dean's actions were not just a mistake, but a criminal act. They argue that his failure to identify himself as police and his quick decision to shoot were grossly negligent. The defense counters, reminding the jury of the split-second decisions officers must make in potentially dangerous situations. They argue that Dean believed he was facing an armed suspect and acted to protect himself and others. After days of testimony, it's time for closing arguments. The air in the courtroom is electric as both sides make their final plea to the jury. The prosecution urges them to hold Dean accountable, to show that no one, not even a police officer, is above the law. The defense implores them to consider the pressures and dangers of police work, asking for understanding and leniency. As the jury files out to deliberate, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. Hours tick by, stretching into days. The wait is excruciating for both sides. Finally, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom holds its collective breath as the judge asks Dean to stand. The tension is noticeable as the verdict is read. In a moment that would echo across the nation,
Aaron York deemed guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the offense of manslaughter, assessed his punishment at confinement in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for 11 years, 10 months, 12 days.
Next, David Carrick, a name that once commanded respect, now sends shivers down spines. For 2 decades, this Metropolitan police officer led a double life.
This is the allegation that's been made to us, okay, sir?
There's no necessity.
Yes, there is.
So I've been a police officer for 20 years.
And in many ways, this is a story of the strength of 12 women. When this arrest made the news in 2021, those impacted started to come forward.
By day, he wore a badge. By night, he was a predator. His story is a stark reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight, even behind a uniform. Carrick joined the Met Police in 2001 after a stint in the Army. He seemed like the perfect candidate, disciplined, dedicated, and eager to serve. Little did anyone know, this was the beginning of a reign of terror that would span nearly 2 decades. His first known offense dates back to 2003. Over the next 17 years, Carrick would go on to commit a series of horrific crimes against at least 12 women. His methods were consistent and cruel. He'd meet women on dating apps or in bars, using his status as a police officer to gain their trust. One victim recalled how Carrick bragged about guarding Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Another remembered him showing off his warrant card on their first date. These weren't just pickup lines. They were calculated moves to lower his victims' defenses. Once alone with his victims, Carrick's true nature emerged. He'd become controlling and violent. Women reported being locked in small cupboards under the stairs for hours. Some were urinated on, beaten, and assaulted. One victim was attacked with an adult toy so violently she had to seek medical attention. Carrick's crimes weren't limited to physical abuse. He employed psychological tactics too. He'd tell his victims they were worthless, that no one would believe them over a police officer. He isolated them from friends and family, controlled their finances, and monitored their movements. In one particularly harrowing incident, Carrick held a gun to a woman's head. The message was clear. He had the power of life and death over her. Despite the severity and frequency of his crimes, Carrick managed to evade justice for years. How? The answer lies in a toxic mix of institutional failings and the power of the badge he carried. Between 2000 and 2021, Carrick was the subject of multiple complaints. There were accusations of domestic violence, harassment, and assault. Yet, time and again, he faced no serious consequences. Internal investigations were dropped. Criminal complaints didn't make it to court.
He was accused of harassing an ex-partner. No action was taken. Over the next 6 years, he raped several women.
In 2021, everything changed. A woman came forward with an allegation against Carrick. This time, the complaint stuck. As news of his arrest spread, more victims found the courage to speak out. The floodgates opened, and the true extent of Carrick's crimes began to emerge. The investigation that followed uncovered a pattern of behavior so shocking it sent shockwaves through the entire Metropolitan Police Force. Detectives pieced together a timeline of abuse spanning nearly 2 decades. The sheer scale of Carrick's offenses was staggering. As the case built against him, disturbing details about Carrick's personality came to light. Colleagues described him as cocky and a womanizer. He was known to brag about his sexual conquests, often in degrading terms. In retrospect, these were red flags that had been ignored for far too long. The investigation also revealed Carrick's fascination with weaponry. Beyond his service firearm, he owned a collection of legally held guns. This arsenal added an extra layer of intimidation to his interactions with victims. By the time the case reached court, the evidence against Carrick was overwhelming. DNA evidence, witness testimonies, and digital footprints all pointed to his guilt. The man who had hidden behind his badge for so long was finally exposed. Now let's rewind to January 2023. Carrick stands in the dock at London's Southwark Crown Court. The air is thick with tension. Victims, their families, and fellow officers pack the room. As the charges are read, gasps echo through the courtroom. Each count feels like a punch to the gut for those present. 49 charges, 24 rapes, crimes spanning 17 years. Each detail is more horrifying than the last. Carrick used his position to gain trust, then shattered it in the worst ways possible. The courtroom listens in stunned silence as the prosecutor outlines a pattern of behavior so twisted, it's hard to comprehend. But how did he evade justice for so long? That's where this case gets even darker. Carrick's job as a firearms officer in an elite unit gave him a shield of authority. He wasn't just any cop. He was part of the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command. This prestigious position allowed him to brush off complaints and intimidate victims. As the prosecutor speaks, eyes dart between Carrick and the judge. The former officer stands motionless, his face a mask of indifference. But the courtroom? It's a powder keg of emotions. Anger, disgust, and a deep sense of betrayal fill the air. Victims' impact statements cut through the silence. Words like monster and pure evil hang in the air. One survivor describes feeling worthless. Another speaks of nightmares that never end. A third recounts how Carrick's actions destroyed her faith in the police, the very institution meant to protect her.
I don't trust the police anymore. My anxiety now affects all aspects of my life, and I struggle to go anywhere on my own.
What happened to me broke me. I was whipped, urinated on, and locked naked in a cupboard. I was told I was worthless and would be better off dead.
The weight of their pain is obvious. Some in the courtroom weep openly. Others clench their fists, barely containing their rage. The collective trauma in the room is overwhelming, a testament to the far-reaching impact of Carrick's crimes.
Before we begin, Alice's hands tremble. This is so hard for her, but she's clear about why she's sharing her story.
I didn't want to be known as a rape victim.
Then, a twist. Carrick's own lawyer paints a picture of a broken man, claiming childhood trauma led to his crimes. The courtroom bristles. Is this an explanation or an excuse? The defense argues that Carrick's upbringing in an abusive household warped his view of relationships. They point to his alcoholism and depression as mitigating factors. But for many, these arguments fall flat. The prosecution quickly counters, reminding the court of Carrick's calculated behavior. This wasn't a man out of control, they argue, but one who carefully selected his victims and used his position to silence them. As the judge prepares to deliver the sentence, the atmosphere shifts. This moment, years in the making, will determine if justice truly prevails. The words come like hammer blows.
This makes a total of 36 life sentences. The minimum term you will have to serve before the parole board can think of releasing you is 30 years, 239 days.
But the story doesn't end here. As Carrick is led away, whispers start. How many others like him are still out there? How deep does this problem go in the police force? The case has exposed serious flaws in the vetting process for police officers. Carrick had faced multiple complaints over the years, yet remained on the force. This revelation sends shockwaves through the criminal justice system. Calls for reform echo beyond the courtroom walls.
He was vetted again and passed. In 2019, he allegedly assaulted a woman in Hertfordshire. He got a mild reprimand and the matter was dropped.
In the days following the sentencing, public outrage grows. Protests erupt outside police stations. Demands for accountability reach fever pitch. The Met Police, already under scrutiny, faces a crisis of confidence.
We can't rely on the police to protect us from violence against women, which is one of the most prevalent crimes in our society.
Political leaders weigh in, promising investigations and changes. But for many, these words ring hollow. The damage to public trust is deep and may take years to repair.
All I can say is, I'm sorry that we've let you down.
The media frenzy surrounding the case brings other victims forward. Women who had stayed silent, fearing they wouldn't be believed, now find the courage to speak out. It becomes clear that Carrick's case, as horrifying as it is, might just be the tip of the iceberg. Support groups for victims of police abuse see a surge in calls. Mental health professionals warn of the long-lasting impact on not just Carrick's direct victims, but on public perception of law enforcement as a whole. Legal experts begin to re-examine old cases, looking for signs of similar abuse of power. The ripple effects of Carrick's crimes spread far and wide, touching every corner of the criminal justice system. As the dust settles, attention turns to prevention. How can we stop another David Carrick? Proposals range from enhanced psychological screening for officers to independent oversight committees. But implementing these changes proves challenging, met with resistance from some within the police force itself. The case also sparks a broader conversation about power dynamics and consent. Schools and universities update their curricula, emphasizing the importance of healthy relationships and recognizing abuse. While the sentencing brings some closure, the road to healing stretches out before them. Support services scramble to meet the increased demand, highlighting the need for long-term care for survivors of sexual assault. In the aftermath of the trial, a new normal emerges. Citizens eye their local police with newfound suspicion. Officers report feeling under constant scrutiny, their every action questioned. The trust between law enforcement and the public, once taken for granted, now hangs by a thread. The courtroom may be empty, but the fallout is just beginning. Carrick's case has blown the lid off a Pandora's box of police misconduct, leaving us with unsettling questions. If we can't trust those sworn to protect us, who can we trust? How many more David Carricks are lurking behind badges, waiting to be exposed? David Carrick's horrifying abuse of power revealed the depths of corruption within law enforcement, but the next case highlights another tragic failure of duty.
Eric DeValconaire is not Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd. Eric DeValconaire is not one of the 3 men in Georgia convicted of running down and murdering Ahmaud Arbery.
A single gunshot echoes through a Kansas City backyard. In seconds, a life is snuffed out. But this isn't your typical crime scene. The man holding the smoking gun? A decorated police detective. The victim? An unarmed civilian. What happens when the thin blue line shatters and a cop becomes the killer? Today, we dive deep into the case that rocked Kansas City and sparked a national debate on police accountability. December 3rd, 2019. A quiet neighborhood in Kansas City, Missouri. The air is crisp and the streets are calm, but that calm is about to be shattered. Detective Eric DeValkenir and his partner are in hot pursuit of a red pickup truck. The driver, Cameron Lamb, pulls into his own backyard. What happens next will change lives forever and ignite a firestorm of controversy. DeValkenir claims he saw Lamb point a gun at his partner.
Pulling up to defendant's house, Sergeant Schwam pulling into the driveway, immediately getting out with his weapon drawn, rapidly moving into the backyard carport garage area of the house, and defendant doing the same.
In a split-second decision, he fires. 2 shots ring out, cutting through the winter air. Lamb slumps over the steering wheel, fatally wounded. But as investigators comb the scene, questions start to pile up. Where's the gun Lamb had allegedly pointed? The crime scene tells a different story than the one DeValkenir is spinning. Let's rewind a bit. Who was Cameron Lamb? A 26-year-old father of 3, Lamb was known to his friends and family as a devoted dad who loved working on cars. He had his struggles, sure, but who doesn't? On that fateful day, he was just pulling into his own backyard. Now, he'll never walk out of it again. And DeValkenir? A seasoned detective with years on the force, decorated, respected, trusted to uphold the law. But on that December day, did he cross a line that can never be uncrossed? Months pass, investigations are conducted. Finally, in June 2020, DeValkenir was charged with involuntary manslaughter and armed criminal action. It's a rare move. Police officers are seldom charged for on-duty shootings. The thin blue line holds firm, usually, but not this time. Fast forward to November 2021. The courtroom is packed, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge J. Dale Youngs delivers his verdict. DeValkenir is found guilty on both counts. The judge's words cut through the silence. It's a bombshell. A serving police officer convicted for an on-duty shooting.
Where a police officer has been charged, convicted, and sentenced for killing one of his citizens that he's supposed to protect and serve.
But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of a new chapter in this twisted tale. March 4th, 2022, sentencing day. The air is electric with anticipation. Lamb's family fills one side of the courtroom. Their faces a mix of grief and hope for justice. On the other side, DeValkenir's supporters, including fellow officers, sit in stoic silence. As DeValkenir sits before the judge, his face is a mask of composure, but beneath that calm exterior, what thoughts race through his mind? Is he replaying that fateful day in December? The sound of the gunshots? The sight of Lamb slumped over the wheel? Or is he already imagining the long years ahead, trapped behind bars, a cop among cons? Judge Youngs doesn't mince words. He sentences DeValkenir to 3 years for involuntary manslaughter and 6 years for armed criminal action. The sentences will run consecutively.
Eric DeValkenir on count 1, the Class E felony of involuntary manslaughter in the 2nd degree. I sentence you to a term of incarceration in the Missouri Division of Adult Institutions of 3 years. On the unclassified felony of armed criminal action, I sentence you to a term of incarceration of 6 years.
But wait, there's more. In a twist that sends shockwaves through the room, Judge Youngs suspends the execution of the sentence. Instead, he placed DeValkenir on probation for 3 years. The fallen detective avoids prison time, for now. The room explodes in chaos. What just happened?
A date for sentencing will be determined after further consultation with counsel. The court will order the preparation of a sentencing assessment report. If the defendant chooses to file a motion for new trial, his deadline for doing so is extended 10 days. I will order the defendant remain free on bond pending sentencing. That will be the court's order. Counsel will withdraw their exhibits. Eric DeValkenir is not Derek Chauvin, who murdered George Floyd. Eric DeValkenir is not one of the 3 men in Georgia convicted of running down and murdering Ahmaud Arbery.
The reaction is immediate and intense. Lamb's family is stunned, their hopes for justice dashed in an instant. They'd hoped for a harsher sentence, a clear message that no one is above the law. Lori Bay, Lamb's mother, speaks outside the courthouse, her voice trembling with emotion.
This has been just a hurtful tragedy for our family, and the healing is just not there yet.
On the other side, DeValkenir supporters breathe a collective sigh of relief. To them, he's a dedicated officer who made a split-second decision in a high-pressure situation. They argue that the punishment doesn't fit the circumstances. He was just doing his job. As DeValkenir leaves the courthouse, a free man for now, the debate rages on. His case becomes a lightning rod for discussions about power and justice in America. Some see it as a rare instance of a police officer being held accountable. Others view it as an overcorrection, a sacrificial lamb to appease public anger. But amidst the heated arguments and media frenzy, let's not forget the human cost. Cameron Lamb, a 26-year-old father of 3, will never return home. His children will grow up without their father. His mother will never hear his laugh again. And Eric DeValkenir, once a respected detective, now bears the weight of a man's death on his conscience. The case raises difficult questions. How can we ensure that police officers can do their jobs effectively while also protecting citizens from excessive force? And when tragedy strikes, how do we determine a just punishment? Police departments across the country are watching closely, reevaluating their use of force policies. Activists are using the case as a rallying cry for further reforms. And what of DeValkenir himself? As he begins his probation, he's a man caught between two worlds. No longer a cop, not quite a convict. His career in law enforcement is over, his reputation in tatters. But he's not behind bars. Is this justice? The answer depends on who you ask. The case also shines a spotlight on the role of police unions. Throughout the trial and sentencing, the local police union stood firmly behind DeValkenir. As the dust settles on this explosive case, questions linger. Will DeValkenir's probation stand, or will he eventually serve time? How will this verdict impact policing in Kansas City and beyond? And in the end, can justice ever truly be served when a life is lost? Eric DeValkenir's tragic misuse of authority left a family grieving, but the next case delves into corruption on an entirely different scale.
Joseph Miedzianowski. What is perhaps most chilling about Miedzianowski's story is the duality of his life. He wasn't just a corrupt cop, he was living a double life, both personally and professionally.
In December 1998, the arrest of Joseph Miedzianowski, a 22-year-old veteran of the Chicago Police Department, shocked the community. Joseph, 45 years old at the time, was arrested as he reported to work with the gang crime unit. According to the prosecutors, Joseph ran a drug ring that distributed millions of dollars worth of narcotics between Chicago and Miami between 1995 and 1998. The prosecutors alleged that Joseph served as a middleman in deals, brokering connections between feuding dealers. However, his involvement went beyond mere brokering. According to the prosecutors, Joseph eventually took control of the daily operations of the operation, overseeing all aspects of the business. One of the allegations against Joseph was that he pocketed $22,000 per month from the dealers. This money, the prosecutors said, was used to pay off police officers, to throw investigators off Joseph's trail. Additionally, Joseph was accused of providing stolen guns and ammunition obtained from the Cook County Sheriff's Department's shooting range to known criminals. After Joseph's arrest, his attorney spoke to the media and denied the allegations. The attorney argued that despite the recorded conversation between Joseph and the dealers, it was all part of an undercover operation that Joseph was working on. According to his attorney, the charges against Joseph were a mere fairy tale concocted by the Bureau. They argued that the FBI had selectively pieced together fragments of conversations that, when taken out of context, sounded bad. However, when considered as a whole, the message communicated by Joseph was entirely innocent. The prosecutors maintained that Joseph's actions betrayed his sworn duty to protect and serve the community. Joseph adamantly denied any wrongdoing during his trial in 2001. He testified that he was an honest, hardworking officer that dedicated his life to serving and protecting the community. He claimed that he took down some of the most dangerous drug lords operating on the streets of Chicago, making a significant impact on reducing crime in the city. Despite his claims, the jury was not swayed by Joseph's testimony. They found him guilty on all counts, sentencing him to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 5 years of imprisonment. At his sentencing hearing, the judge admonished Joseph, stating that he had failed in his duties as a police officer and had not served and protected the citizens he was sworn to protect. Instead, he had been protecting the dealers. In 2021, Joseph, now 68, sought to reduce his sentence under the First Steps Act. However, Joseph's bid was met with disappointment as a federal district judge denied the motion, citing Joseph's double life and the damage he had caused to those around him. Joseph's story is a cautionary tale about the dire consequences of corruption within the police force. As an officer, he had the power to make life-altering decisions, but instead, he chose to abuse that power for personal gain. While Joseph Miedzianowski earned the title of most corrupt cop, his crimes didn't involve children. Dennis Perkins and his ex-wife Cynthia, however, crossed that unforgivable line.
He was a deputy with the Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office who was raping children. His wife was a school teacher. He was ejaculating on pastries. She was serving them to her class.
In October 2019, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received an anonymous tip that implicated Dennis Perkins, a Livingston Parish Sheriff deputy, in possessing explicit images of a child. This tip set off a 5-year investigation, culminating in Dennis's eventual arrest and the discovery of a vast trove of evidence against him and his wife, Cynthia. When the detectives questioned Dennis, he refused to disclose any details and immediately requested an attorney. Frustrated by his silence, the detectives informed Dennis that they had a warrant for his arrest and that he had been fired from his job at the Livingston Parish Sheriff's Department. Dennis's wife, Cynthia, was arrested alongside him. Crime scene investigators seized the couple's electronic devices from their home, and a thorough examination revealed a mountain of evidence against the couple. One particularly damning piece of evidence was video footage depicting him assaulting an unconscious woman. In addition to assaulting women, Dennis also engaged in inappropriate behavior while on duty. The prosecutors discovered multiple videos that depicted him having intercourse with women suspects on the side of the road, to blackmail these women into those acts under threats that he could make life hard for them if they refused. Dennis's abuse of power and manipulation of vulnerable individuals are truly reprehensible. However, the most disturbing aspect of the case against Dennis is the revelation that investigators uncovered 60 images of a child under the age of 13. It became apparent to detectives that these photos were taken with hidden cameras around Dennis Perkins' home, including his bathroom. Furthermore, investigators discovered an image of a man they believed to be Dennis leaving his DNA behind on small cakes. It was later found that his wife's 7th grade class consumed the cakes. In total, Dennis's victims included 2 children, 2 adults, and a dog. Dennis and Cynthia Perkins faced a staggering 150 felony charges. Cynthia filed for divorce from Dennis shortly after their arrests, claiming she was afraid of him. As the case moved forward, the prosecution quickly realized it would be a lengthy and emotionally challenging trial for everyone involved.
We felt satisfied that this accomplished justice, and we were able to get a win without putting the victims and this entire community, through the rigors of that trial that was going to happen next week.
Cynthia pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 41 years in prison. On the other hand, Dennis pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 100 years in prison. During Dennis's sentencing hearing, he took a moment to address his victims and apologize for his actions. He stated that he hoped that those who had suffered as a result of his abuse could find forgiveness and healing through Jesus Christ.
So at the end of the day, she does admit she had some part to play in this.
Absolutely.
One woman had the opportunity to give a victim impact statement during the hearing. She called Dennis sick and said his actions were deplorable, expressing her relief that he would be out of power and unable to harm others. The woman expressed her satisfaction that he would be spending the rest of his days behind bars, adding in a sarcastic tone that she sincerely hoped he would have a nice life in prison. Dennis Perkins committed unspeakable crimes, but he didn't take a life. The same can't be said for these corrupt Atlanta officers, whose actions led to the tragic death of an unarmed 92-year-old woman in 2006. On November 21, 2006, in Atlanta, Georgia, a group of police officers led by officers Jason Smith, Greg Jr., and Arthur Tesler arrived at the home of a 92-year-old woman named Katherine Johnson. The officers, dressed in bulletproof vests and equipped with riot shields, approached Johnson's residence with a no-knock warrant. As they made entry into the home, the officers announced their presence before stepping inside. Inside was Katherine Johnson, who had an old, rusty revolver for self-defense since she lived in a rough part of the city and had recently installed extra locks on her door. Upon hearing the officers announce themselves, Katherine fired the weapon in the direction of the officers. Katherine's bullet didn't strike any of the officers, but the incident sparked a chaotic exchange. In the moments that followed, officers Jason Smith, Greg Jr. and Arthur Tesler, fired at Catherine Johnson a total of 39 shots. At least 5 of those shots struck the older woman, ultimately causing her to lose her life. The officers arrested Johnson as she was dying in her living room, and she was pronounced deceased by paramedics at the scene. The tragic shooting of Catherine Johnson sparked outrage and debate in the community, highlighting the ongoing tensions between the police and citizens. It was later revealed that Jason Smith had planted 3 bags of cannabis in Catherine Johnson's home. According to court reports, the 3 officers conspired to create a false story to deceive homicide detectives. In October 2008, all 3 ex-officers pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights resulting in death, as well as charges related to manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, and perjury. The officers testified that at the time of the shooting, they were under a lot of pressure from their superiors within the Atlanta Police Department, which led them to fabricate evidence and lie. They claimed that they were not properly trained to handle the situation. On February 24, 2009, former officer Greg Jr. was sentenced to 6 years in prison, Jason Smith to 10 years, and Arthur Tesler to 5 years. They were also each ordered to pay $8,180, which was the cost of Catherine Johnson's funeral expenses. The Atlanta Police Department implemented several changes in the aftermath of Catherine Johnson's death. The police department made adjustments to its policies and training protocols, aiming to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Specifically to the narcotics team. Additionally, all former members of the narcotics unit were replaced, indicating a commitment to rebuild the team with officers who demonstrate integrity and uphold ethical standards. Furthermore, the shooting of Catherine Johnson brought the issue of no-knock warrants to the forefront of the public consciousness. The purpose of a no-knock warrant is to prevent offenders from having time to destroy evidence, but the tragic incident highlighted the potential for unintended consequences. As a result, the Senate voted to tighten restrictions to make it harder to obtain warrants. This change in legislation aimed to strike a balance between the need for effective law enforcement and the safeguarding of innocent lives. These dirty cops thought they could escape justice, but their reactions say it all. And we're not stopping here. The next video reveals even more jaw-dropping cases you won't want to miss. Stay tuned. The story's far from over.